In 1600, a group of London merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for the right to trade with Asia. They were given a charter, not an army, not a navy, just a piece of paper and a dream of profit. 150 years later, that same company of merchants would command armies larger than most European nations. They would fight dozens of wars, overthrow kings, and collect taxes from 200 million people. By 1858, Britain would rule the largest empire on earth, and at its heart, a single subcontinent that it had taken not by royal decree, but one corrupt deal, one broken alliance, and one catastrophic battle at a time. This is the real story of how the British conquered India, and it's far stranger and far darker than history books dare explain. To understand how Britain took India, you first have to understand what India was. At this point in history, the Indian subcontinent was not a single nation. It was a galaxy of kingdoms, sultanates, and empires, each with its own army, treasury, and ambition. The mightiest of them all was the Mughal Empire. At its peak in the 17th century, the Mughal Empire controlled roughly 25% of global GDP, more than France, more than England, more than any European power at the time. Its cities were among the largest and most sophisticated on earth. Agra, Delhi, Lahore, Dhaka. Europe, by contrast, was hungry, competitive, and increasingly desperate for access to Eastern goods. Spices were more valuable than gold. Cotton cloth from India was so coveted that the British Parliament banned its import to protect local weavers. Into this world of wealth and complexity sailed the East India Company, a private corporation with shareholders, accountants, and a ruthless eye for profit. This moment reshaped the balance of power so completely that its reverberations are still felt today. The East India Company, or ICE, didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as petitioners. Their first envoy, William Hawkins, sailed to the Mughal court of Emperor Jahangir in 1608 and begged for trading rights. Jahangir was unimpressed. The English were seen as minor sea pirates from a cold, irrelevant island. But the company was persistent. They established small factories, not manufacturing plants, but fortified trading posts at Surat on the west coast, then Madras on the south, then Bombay. Then, crucially, Calcutta, in the rich Bengal Delta. For much of the 1600s, the company played by Mughal rules. They paid customs duties. They negotiated. They smiled and bowed. But something was changing. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb died in 1707 after a long, exhausting reign that had overstretched the empire militarily and economically. What followed was catastrophic, a succession crisis that never ended. Between 1707 and 1757, the Mughal throne changed hands a dozen times. Regional governors, the Nawabs, declared effective independence. Persian invaders sacked Delhi. The Maratha Confederacy carved up the center of the subcontinent. The empire that had seemed eternal was bleeding out. The company watched. And it learned. The moment everything changed began with an insult and a catastrophe. In 1756, the new Nawab of Bengal, Siraj ud-Daulah, young, proud, and deeply suspicious of the company's growing power, marched on Calcutta. The British had been quietly fortifying their settlement without his permission, building walls, stockpiling cannons, acting less like merchants and more like rulers. Siraj captured Fort William with ease. The British commander fled. Those left behind were crowded into the fort's tiny dungeon, later infamous as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The British death toll that night was disputed and likely exaggerated by company propaganda. But the story it generated was not. Back in Madras, a company officer received the news of Calcutta's fall. His name was Robert Clive. Clive was not a military genius by birth. He was a troubled young man from Shropshire who had nearly died by suicide twice before finding his purpose in violence and ambition. He had already pulled off one spectacular military coup at Arcot in 1751, holding a besieged fort with 200 men against 10,000. Now, he was given a fleet, an army, and permission to retake Bengal. What followed was not simply a battle. It was a conspiracy. On paper, the Battle of Plassey should have been a massacre. Siraj ud-Daulah commanded between 50,000 and 68,000 men. Clive had roughly 3,000, a mix of British regulars and Indian sepoys. But Clive had something far more dangerous than numbers. He had a letter. In the weeks before the battle, Clive had negotiated in secret with Mir Jafar, Siraj's own commander-in-chief. The deal was straightforward and utterly treacherous. Mir Jafar would betray the Nawab on the battlefield. In exchange, he would be made the new Nawab of Bengal. A puppet. A company puppet. The battle itself lasted barely 3 hours. Siraj's artillery fired first. But a sudden monsoon cloudburst soaked his powder stores, silencing his guns. The British, forewarned, had covered their ammunition. Siraj's commanders hesitated. Mir Jafar's massive flank, tens of thousands of soldiers, simply stood still. When Clive's forces advanced, the Nawab's army crumbled. Siraj fled on a racing camel. He was captured days later and executed, stabbed to death in a corridor by Mir Jafar's own son. Mir Jafar was made Nawab. The company collected £3 million in compensation, equivalent to billions today. Robert Clive pocketed a personal fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in Britain. Bengal, the richest province in India, now answered to a corporation. What history books often fail to explain is this: the British did not conquer India in one campaign. They did it gradually, legally, and by invitation. Until the invitations stopped and the coercion began, the playbook repeated across the subcontinent. Find a kingdom in crisis, back one claimant. Demand repayment in land, attach a subsidiary alliance, a treaty that forced Indian rulers to host company troops at their own expense. When they inevitably fell into debt paying for this protection, the company seized their territory. The Doctrine of Lapse, introduced in the 1840s by Governor-General Dalhousie, was even blunter. If a ruler died without a natural male heir, the company simply annexed the state. No negotiation. No appeal. Kingdom after kingdom vanished. Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, Awadh. The Maratha Confederacy, the last power capable of truly resisting, was broken across 3 brutal wars between 1775 and 1818. Tipu Sultan of Mysore, perhaps the most formidable opponent the company ever faced, died defending his fort at Seringapatam in 1799. By 1850, the British East India Company controlled the single largest territorial empire the world had ever seen. Administered not by a government, but by a for-profit corporation. The consequences were immediate and violent. In 1857, Indian soldiers, sepoys, in the company's own army mutinied. The trigger was a rumor that new rifle cartridges were greased with the fat of pigs and cows, offending both Muslim and Hindu soldiers alike. But the real cause ran far deeper. Decades of dispossession, broken promises, cultural contempt, the annexation of beloved kingdoms. The uprising, called the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, spread across northern and central India. Delhi fell to the rebels. The last Mughal emperor was declared the symbolic leader of resistance. The British response was ferocious. Entire villages burned. Mass executions. Men tied to the mouths of cannons and blown apart as a warning. The rebellion was crushed. But it ended the East India Company forever. In 1858, the British Crown formally dissolved the company and took direct control of India. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. A viceroy replaced the company's board of directors. What had begun as a trade mission was now an empire. The borders you see on that map today, the partition lines that divided a subcontinent in 1947 and left millions dead or displaced, were drawn by men who had inherited the company's logic. That India was a territory to be managed, divided, and controlled. Economists have estimated that Britain drained between $45 trillion in wealth from India during the colonial period through taxation, export extraction, and deindustrialization that deliberately destroyed India's textile and manufacturing base. India, which once produced 25% of global GDP, had been reduced to under 4% by the time independence arrived in 1947. This is not ancient history. It is the economic architecture of the modern world. And yet, the story of how the British conquered India is also a story of extraordinary failure of resistance, because resistance was everywhere. From Siraj ud-Daulah's defiance to Tipu Sultan's wars to the Rani of Jhansi charging into battle rather than surrender, India did not fall passively. It was taken, one betrayal at a time. The real story behind the British conquest of India is not about the genius of empire. It's about the cost of fragmentation and the price paid by millions who had no say in the deals made in their name. The East India Company. A corporation that became a conqueror. A story that begins with a trading charter and ends with the largest empire in human history. If this kind of deep dive history is what you're looking for, hit like and subscribe. We go this deep every week.